state their name and title each time you begin speaking or voting so that you can be readily identified by remote listeners. All participants are required to ensure that microphones, phones, or other electronic devices are muted when not speaking. The ability of remote listeners or observers to hear the proceedings are not unnecessarily impeded. Excuse me, public comment will not be allowed at this meeting. During this meeting, the committee will not recess to a closed or executive meeting pursuant to KSA 754319 and amendments thereto. And each motion, if any, will be clearly stated before the committee votes, and the chair will announce the results of the final vote. That's all for me.
Thank you, Jenna. We will officially begin the meeting. Thank every one of you for coming to the meeting and attending. And those that may be listening in, thank you. So the first thing I have on the agenda is to discuss the literature that was distributed both electronically and handed to you at some point. And to that end, I handed out or sent out my notes from my review of that literature. So unless there's objection, can we just start with that and go down the line and then discuss each one as we go? Is that okay? Thank you, Senator Fascadeau. Let me get my copy. The first document I reviewed in my folder was the NCSL document, the Occupational License, Assessing State Policies and Practices, their final report. It was based on a consortium of 18 states or 11 states, and then it was added 5 more in 2018. And it was startling. Their report shows that occupational licensing had grown over the past 60 years, comprising nearly 25% of the U.S. workforce, up from 5% 60 years ago. So the growth in this area has been remarkable. And one of the items that they highlighted was that license portability was one thing that all the states were interested in coming up with in their future. Stakeholder engagement is critical. They found that without stakeholder engagement, if you're going to try to make changes in this area legislatively, without that, you're doomed to failure, essentially. And that means, and they found that third-party facilitation was actually one of the things that worked when they worked on this. And also something that we've talked about at great length, the sunrise and sunset provisions are needed that will cause legislators pause before passing laws or when they're reviewing those laws. And their recommendation in that paper was to focus on targeted occupations for best results. In other words, don't try to do an overall change at once, work on 1 or 2 at a time, or even 1 at a time to further your goal of making a dent in this, what we perceive as an impediment to occupations or impediment to workforce and that sort of thing. So any discussion on the NCSL document?
No.
Thank you, Senator. I think Representative Carmichael muted himself big time here. Okay, moving on. Also, I looked at the research department's document they handed out, the table and listing of the agencies. Do you remember reading that? And yes. My take on that, as we looked at it, was that it was pretty heavy-handed in those occupations or agencies or boards. For example, the state fire marshal area, the fireworks permit, and the fire inspector, the person that goes out and inspects the facilities across the state. Those were, I think, a bit onerous. That's what popped out at me. And the fitting and dispensing of hearing instruments based on the new laws that have been passed, making that no longer an FDA requirement, I think this one is really over the top. And cosmetology, although they've made some changes recently. Any comments on that document?
I'm sorry, I'm still here. I just managed to reduce the screen so I can't see what's going on, but nothing in particular.
Are you okay with my comments so far?
Well, this is Representative Carmichael. I'm not entirely sure what our mission here is. I understand that there are some agencies that folks think are too restrictive in their professional licensure requirements. And I suspect there are others where we're too lax. But I guess I'm just not sure, Mr. Chairman, what is our end objective here?
That's a good question, Representative. And I've thought about that. And I think our mission, and we'll discuss it at the end in our report to the full committee, but I think our mission here is to review what information we have in front of us, which we have and we've done. And that is to recommend what steps need to be taken to further the discussion or an possible action in this area. And I think as I've gone through this, I think the two areas that popped out to me is the one of the licensing of spouses of military. And the second would be the hiring and the reduction of barriers for those recently incarcerated. I think those two areas, I think, are the two most important for us to highlight and report to the committee. And so those agencies then that are responsible for licensing in those two areas would be the two that I would recommend, and hopefully the subcommittee would recommend that we highlight and suggest actions be taken.
That makes sense.
Are you okay with that?
Yeah, and I got my full screen back now so I can see everybody.
All right.
And
staff, any comment? And Senator?
yes, Mr. Chairman. So I agree 100% with that, especially the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee during the time even when Jake LaTurner was chair at that time, working with a lobbyist, Mark Dugan, I believe. This legislation was heard in our committee. And one of the biggest concerns was for those incarcerated, let's say those that are affiliated or get the training for barbering. And when they were released, they, tried to open up their own barber shop and get a license, and they couldn't. And then with us, the legislature, wanting people to get a job, this was one of the barriers preventing them from doing so. And so I totally support this. I would like to ask if staff, though, because during the hearings, there was much debate about like police and other certain entities that did not, that they had to keep their requirements strict of nature. So if staff could kind of just go over the ones that we really can't address and just refresh my memory on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to talk about that.
Yes, Jenna, I don't know
Yes.
whether you received a copy of her document. Was it last night or yesterday afternoon?
The one that you had sent?
No, the one that you had produced for us, the review of statute, 74 dash whatever.
Yes, I had sent that to all the members of the committee and staff.
Okay, if you would, please.
Yes. Okay, so this is Jenna Moyer in the Revisor of Statutes Office. And I believe what Senator Fuscato was talking about was the changes from federal and state affairs that occurred in 2018, and that is to the statute 74 or KSA 74-120. And it just essentially prevents the blanket denial of certification or licensure registration for occupations for any individual with a civil or criminal record. Prior to this bill, which would have been in 2018 Senate substitute for House Bill 2386, there would be provisions and statutes that would say if you've ever been convicted of any crime, of felony or any moral turpitude type of crime, then you can't get a license. And so the changes to this statute, which I'll go through, specify the requirements that an agency would have to go through in order to deny someone a license or certification. And we can just start in subsection B1. It requires the agencies to list the specific civil and criminal records that would disqualify someone. In paragraph 2, if you have an individual with a disqualifying civil or criminal record, except for a felony or class A misdemeanor, would not be disqualified if more than 5 years have passed since their sentence without any further conviction. And then this would be paragraph 3, would allow an agency to adopt regulations related to advisory opinions. And this is one of the provisions that we heard about in October, at the October Joint Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations meeting. It would allow an individual who has a record to ask the licensing agency for a informal written opinion on whether their past criminal record would disqualify them from licensure. And subsection C lists the licensing agencies excluded from the provisions of this statute. And there are 13, but they would include the Kansas Commission on Peace Officers Standards and Training. So that would be law enforcement, Highway Patrol, accountants, Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board, which would be things like Masters of Social Work, psychologists. Then there's Board of Healing Arts, which would be medical professionals, State Board of Pharmacy, EMS, Board of Nursing, Real Estate Commission, Office of Attorney General, Department of Insurance, municipalities, and any profession that has an educational requirement for licensure that requires a degree beyond a bachelor's degree, which would include things like lawyers. And then, and then I just say in my memo that since passage of these amendments, many agencies have adopted, they've came before the committee to comply with its requirements because a lot of agencies had rules and regulations that did not qualify with the provisions of the statute. And
Thank
I'll
you,
be
Jenna.
happy to answer any questions.
Yes, thank you, Jenna. Are there any questions of Jenna on this?
Yeah, this is John Carmichael. I do have a question.
Please
You
go ahead.
mentioned lawyers. Now, my recollection was that lawyers are licensed by the state Supreme Court pursuant to Supreme Court rule, and that we as the legislature likely don't have the power, if you will, to affect lawyer licensing because that's done by an independent branch of government. Is my recollection not quite on track there?
Yes, Representative, this is Jenna Moyer in the revisor's office. And I was just giving an example. It was the first occupation that came to my mind, something requiring beyond a bachelor's degree. So
Yeah,
it's all in case they left anything out.
Same thing came to my mind, but if we're going to be here talking about lawyer licensing, then I need to do a whole different set of research because I don't think that we can affect that.
Yes, attorneys are licensed by the Supreme Court. So it's a whole separate scheme of licensure.
Any other questions?
So, Mr. Chairman,
Please.
so then is it our ultimate goal to make it easier? I know in the committee there was some other discussion coming from the educational part of it for educators. And I don't know if anyone remembers what was their main, because they were objecting originally. The first hearing, they were in opposition of the bill. And then I think we made some changes, which was a little more digestible to them. And so if you could refresh my memory of what their opposition was, and then Mr. Chairman, is it our goal to try to make it easier for some of those re-entering our communities from prison? Because that day when we were on the original Joint Committee on Rules and Regs, I was on the phone, and so I couldn't hear everything clearly, but then I heard a little piece that piqued my curiosity and concern. So would the ultimate goal be to just address some of those policies and requirements to ease it up a little bit to help those people become employed?
This is Representative Highland again. I think our goal here is to, because of what Jenna has brought forth to us, the 74-120, I think it's one of those things where as legislators, when bills come before us and regulations come before us, we need to make sure that the law is being followed. I think some of them are not following the laws that we have prescribed at this point. So we need to make that point clear to these agencies, and somehow, and I don't have an answer for this, but somehow we need to let these folks know that we're not going to let them get by with ignoring the laws in the future. So how we do that, we can discuss further.
Yeah.
Jenna, I have a couple more questions.
Okay, great.
Mind.
Go ahead.
The first one is on section C, subsection C you have down there. And the word municipalities popped out at me. Is that because of their home rule since what, 1971 in the Constitution?
I'm just going to look up the statutory reference here. Give me just 1 second. Okay. So the definition of municipality here, as referenced in 75-6102, would include county, township, city, school district, or other political or taxing division of the state, or any agency, authority, institution, or other instrumentality thereof. And I would have to look into if home rule applied to all of those. But
municipalities are the ones that have home rule at this point in the Constitution. Counties have it by statute.
I mean, without looking, or this is Jen Moyer, Revisor Statutes Office, without looking to the history of the bill when that was added, I can't give you the exact reason why that language was added, but my best guess would be that some individuals in those institutions asked for it to be included.
Well, if that's included in that definition, I think that's an area that maybe needs to be amended, because that's giving them a blank check not to follow the law. All those agencies, to include the school boards and everybody else. And I don't think that was the intent of the legislation.
Yep. Mr. Chair, I believe that would be a good place to start. If you're looking for amendments, that would be kind of easy to draft and introduce in a bill form, whether you like all the exclusions provided for in subsection C.
Yeah, that would be the one I would look at most closely. Any comments from the other two members of the subcommittee?
No comments from the peanut gallery. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. You, in your comments in your presentation, Jenna, you mentioned that there were several agencies that have started. I see 2 attachments, one from Technical Professions, one from Board of Cosmetology. Were there others besides those 2 that have made an effort?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Jenna Moyer, Revisor Statutes Office, and there have been a lot of agencies. Some have come before JCARR, and then others have actually had to amend their statutes that would say, that list the specific criminal or civil charges that would prohibit someone from licensure, and could maybe look at a list of those, but that would take me quite some time. But there have been several agencies, just in my recollection alone, that have amended both or either statutes or their regulations to comply with the provisions of this law.
Well, I'm not going to ask you to do that. I think what you provided is great, and the municipalities jumped out at me, and that's an area that we need to look at as possible amendments. And I appreciate that report. Thank you very
Mr.
much.
Chairman,
Please, Jill.
this is Jill Shelley with KLRD. The ones that have come to the JCARR regarding amendments based on 74-120 are the Board of Cosmetology, Mortuary Arts, Technical Professions, Hearing Instruments, Adult Care Home Administrators, and Barbering.
And the hearing instruments, what did they do? Can you refresh me?
I can look that up real quick. Let's see.
Well, Jill is looking that up. I think I am not going to waste your time because it's valuable to go over this literature review. I think we've all kind of, when in our reviews, we all see where the problems may lie and areas that we may affect a change. And number one on the list would be that KSA 74-120, looking at subsection C. In the definition of municipalities, I think that's too big a blank check in that area. So we need for the full committee to maybe, we'll recommend looking at that closely and possible bill introduction for amendments on that one. The other one, if you looked at that licensing wheel for teachers, they have made it so difficult. And when I was on the education committee, we realized and asked them to make it easier. They refused. And I've attended 2 meetings with schools in 2 counties where multiple school superintendents were there. And every one of them stood up and said they are unable to hire teachers. And by law, they have to have a certified licensed teacher in every classroom to include on their video streaming to teach by the internet. And that is an impediment in their minds. They can't hire anybody. A lot of the elderly teachers are retiring because they're afraid of the pandemic, on and on and on. And some of the teachers feel they're overworked. They can't do both classroom and the video. And they were complaining. I said, look, we tried in, what was it, 2014-15 to change that, but were summarily defeated by the Board of Education and the State Board. I think it's an area that we need to look at. And in the last meeting when Lyon County, Senator Longmine spoke and said that there is a law passed that they have to change how they license, and specifically here, the spouses of military. And he says they are breaking the law. They have ignored it. I asked research and revisers if they could find that documentation. And do you have that, Jenna? Or that was Jill that provided that to me, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Jen Moy in the Revisor Statutes Office. And what I do have is the statute, and this would have passed in, looks like 2013, was amended in 2015. It's KSA 483406, which requires expedited state licensure procedure if licensed, registered, or certified in another state for military service members or military spouses. And it's kind of a long statute, but it generally provides, notwithstanding any other provision of law, that a licensing body shall, after a military service member or their spouse were to complete all their documents, send it all into the licensing agency, that a decision would have to be made on their license within 60 days. And the sort of the big hole in there of that statute, which we've discussed in the Veterans and Military Affairs Committee, which I staff, is the language notwithstanding any other provision of law. So if another statute, let's say that the teacher licensing statute were to say, well, notwithstanding the provisions, of this law, even if you're a military spouse, we can take as much time as we want. Not saying that they actually do that, but there's authority in that statute to make exceptions.
And I'm assuming that's the one. I sent him a copy of that document and asked him if that's the one he was referring to when he made those statements. He claims they are willfully ignoring the law. So, and I'm not sure what we as a subcommittee or even a committee can do about it.
Mr. Chair, General Moyer, Revisor Statutes Office, as a subcommittee, you can amend that statute, or not as a subcommittee, but as the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations. You could amend this statute or any other statute, however you would like, and we'll be happy to work on it for you.
Well, I do understand that. The point is, we pass laws and they're ignoring them. How can we affect the change if they're ignoring them? I mean, in my opinion, that's where the appropriations committees come in.
Well, Mr. Chairman, this is Representative Carmichael. I have a few observations if you have a moment or two.
We do. Please go ahead.
First thing is, if agencies aren't complying with the law, affected parties, i.e. an applicant, has certainly a right to go to court and compel them to comply with the law. I know that's expensive, and for one person, that's very difficult. As you point out, we have the power of the purse, and if there are agencies that don't seem to be able to comply with the law, then we put budget provisos in, and they don't get any money until such time as they accomplish certain goals, including complying with the law. So, that can be dealt with. But I have to tell you, all due respect, Mr. Chairman, you and I agree on many things. But I don't think this is one where you're going to find a lot of agreement from me. And I personally don't think that we should dumb down the standards for teachers. We didn't fund education, and we drove people out of that occupation, and now we pay the price. But I don't think that we should try to fix the mistake that we've made over the past several years by lessening the requirements to practice one of the most important professions in our society, and that's educating our children. And if we can't get enough teachers, the cure is not to dumb down the licensing requirements, but rather it's to fund education and pay teachers like the profession that they are. That's the way free markets work. And so I guess, and I understand that there has been certainly urban legend that there are people in the military who seemingly can't get licensed. You and I, or their spouses, you and I can recall the trip we made to Fort Riley, where the fine young colonel there, I think he was a colonel, might have been a major. I never can keep one cauliflower straight from another, but that's said in jest, Mr. Chairman. But he explained to us that his spouse couldn't get a license to practice nursing, as I recall, at the hospital there in Junction City. And I've been told by a number of people, though, that process supposedly has been taken care of, but I continue to hear these reports that somewhere there's some agency that's not processing these applications in a timely manner, or somehow is not facilitating the licensure of military dependents. And if that's the case, I'd like to see the specific examples: who, what, where, when. And as I've mentioned in our committee before, that if we find that there's an agency who's denying military spouses and dependents the opportunity to practice their profession, then we need to take some very specific steps with respect to an agency that would do something like that. And I quite frankly don't believe that there is any such agency, but there may be. So I'm going to sit here and I'm going to try to be constructive and try to be helpful. But I think I start from a somewhat different premise, perhaps, than others. So I appreciate your consideration of my comments. Thank you.
Senator Vasconcello.
Mr. Chairman, to Representative Carmichael's point, that's why I asked Jenna if she had information of what during the committee hearings, exactly the educators, what was one or two of their main points of opposition? Do you have that information?
I believe for that, you have to go back into the committee records, right?
Yes, Mr. Chair. General Moyer, Advisor, Statutes Office. I guess I'm kind of unfamiliar with what meeting you're referring to, because I don't remember a specific meeting of the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations where the Department of Education was a specific objection.
No, and I'm sorry, it wasn't in a Joint Committee on Rules and
Okay.
Regs. It was in one of the original hearings
From
on this
2018.
legislation and on the Fed and State Committee.
Okay.
And
That might take me a bit to find, but I can add Representative.
because as I recall, there was some tweak of a compromise made for the educators, the school board that was in the hearings, and you know, so I don't know that. I just like to be refreshed on that. Supporting Representative Carmichael's position on the educational piece, I guess. You know, especially with COVID and what people are doing now. I don't know. I'm just glad I figured out how to do all these different Zooms. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Can we ask that Jenna provide that information later after the meeting if necessary?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
I'll
That'd
be
be
happy
fine.
to do that. And I'll also just chime in. Representative Carmichael had mentioned nursing, and I'll remind you, in 2018, the Nurse Licensure Compact was approved by the legislature. And so a lot of the issues that you may have heard about with nursing in the past, with the passage of the compact that you did in 2018, a lot of those issues have been taken care of because all the states, a group of states got together and agreed, hey, there's going to be these common set of standards for nurses. So it made the licensure a lot more streamlined for nurses, at least.
Good, thank you. Representative Carmichael, I need to correct.
Mr. Chair, it looks like Jordan had something he wanted to chime in.
Okay, Jordan, go ahead, please. You need to turn on your mic. We cannot hear you. While he's looking for that, I want to correct a misunderstanding between Representative Carmichael and myself. I am not suggesting that we dumb down the credentials for teachers. What I am suggesting is that if we have teachers that are fully qualified in other states and met all those requirements, and I'm talking about military spouses now, that they be given consideration for a temporary or whatever licensing without delays of extended period of time. That's all I'm suggesting.
And Chairman, I certainly did not understand that. And so if all we're here to talk about is reciprocity and professional licensing, then I think that that's a much easier task. If on the other hand, we're going to start talking about whether life experience qualifies someone to teach STEM classes and obtain a teacher certification based on the fact that they worked at Boeing 25 years and therefore their experience can be substituted for education, that's where my difficulties lie. And as I'm sure the chairman recalls, We had some bills on that point back in 2014, if memory serves, about certifying teachers based on life experience and the like. And I didn't agree with what the legislature did, but my views didn't carry the day. So, but I appreciate what you're saying. If we've got a problem with reciprocity, then that's something that ought to be fixed.
Well, so far, I would say that the two areas that we've highlighted in our discussion is reciprocity and the subsection C and the 74-120 and the definition of municipalities. Those are the two areas that I see we have highlighted to this point in our discussion. And
Now,
Gordon, are you able to speak at this point? Jordan? I don't think he can hear us now.
Well, Mr. Chairman, while Mr. Milholland looks for his microphone, one other thing I might add, though, is that just because someone is licensed as a teacher in Arkansas, in my opinion, does not mean they're necessarily qualified to teach Kansas school children either. So I'd worry about just absolute blanket reciprocity, because there are states that have lower standards than our own. And I would hate to see us be reduced to the lowest common denominator as it relates to the qualifications of teachers.
I have no trouble with that statement. Jordan, are you able to speak to us yet?
Oh,
Mr. Chair, can you guys hear me now?
We can. Please go ahead.
Mr.
Great.
Chairman.
I think Senator Foscato might have a point to make.
I just have a quick question. So I received a text message from Senator Mary Ware. Are they able to get on and join us or not? She said she was attempting to do so and could not. So
I believe, I may be wrong, I'll ask Jill and Jenna to correct me. I believe this is a subcommittee meeting. They can listen, but I'm not sure they will be able to ask questions and just jump in. So correct me if I'm wrong.
That's how it's been set up, sir.
Does that answer your question, Senator? Thank you. Okay, Jordan, you wanted to say something, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Using a little bit different setup today, so I had to plug in some headphones to be able to speak to you all, so I apologize for that. I was just going to reply to Senator Foscato's question about the bill from Fed and State. So I staff the Senate Fed and State Committee. And last year we had a hearing on Senate Bill 220, and that bill would have specifically exempted the Department of Education from, added it to the list that Jenna provided in her memo, basically. From what I recall from the committee hearing, I don't want to speak for the department, of course, but they described their own internal process for considering licensees. And they brought up a couple examples of cases where they had teachers who may not have been convicted of a crime for certain actions that they took, but they felt that they still wanted to be able to review the situation specifically internally. And so that seemed to be their argument that I remember. Of course, there could have been other arguments, and I would be happy to provide a copy of their testimony, written testimony from that meeting if you all would like that.
Jordan, could you say what bill that was again?
Yeah, that was Senate Bill 220.
If you would provide the committee, the subcommittee, and the entire committee, as it turns out, a copy of that testimony, we'd appreciate it.
Sure, not a problem.
Thank you, Jordan. Any further comments before we move on? Seeing none, in the interest of moving swiftly on, The recommendations that we've heard so far are a look at reciprocity, not for blanket, but to have it studied and be judiciously applied. And those professions that require more training and more specific background, they would have less pressure to have a total reciprocity. I know my profession, veterinary medicine, we only have reciprocity with a few states. Other than that, if I want to go practice in Florida, I have to pass their exams. I'm not sure about the law profession, how they operate. Now, the human side, they do have licensing across the country, but I think they also have to do a cursory at the state level to practice in a different state. But we all have our state boards, and then we all have our national boards that we have to pass, as does the nursing and all of that. So, but we need to take a close look at it. The other one is, and I think we should hone in on this one very carefully, is the definition of municipalities within that regulation. And then we need to ask for a drill down to see if we can find agency that are willfully disregarding the laws that have been passed as far as this. And I think some of the licensing boards now are trying to protect themselves, and it's excluding, and in my reading of all these documents, the minorities and the lower income folks are the hardest hit by some of these licensing requirements. And I'd like to see us as a state take a little closer look at that. I really like the Arizona, when they passed the right to earn a living law. I think it was an excellent, and let's see if I can find it real quick. That's in that was in the Mercatus Center Policy Brief, Occupational License Reform and the Rights to Earn a Living, a Blueprint for Action. Arizona became the first state to officially enact a formal right to earn a living measure in 2018. I think we as a state ought to take a look at that. And that may be something that will move this along a little quicker than maybe some of the other things that we can do. And that's the limit of my suggestions. I'm open to others. Before that,
Well,
Jill, we need to have from you, we asked a question earlier, and I can't even remember what it was now.
It was on the hearing instruments.
Oh, yeah.
They brought to the JCARR a new rule and regulation, which is, too many windows open right now, sorry. JCARR 67-1-8, and it was brand new for them, potentially disqualifying civil and criminal records, advisory opinion fee. So you heard that last August or October.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Senator Fascadeau, any recommendations, suggestions?
Mr. Chairman, I believe I am in support of what we've already discussed. I would just ask the law that was passed in Arizona, the right to earn a living, will you email that to us? Do you have a copy, or you were just referencing that?
It was referenced in one of the documents that was sent out. And
Okay.
I would ask the reviser if they could find that law for us and share that with everybody.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'll be happy to see if I can find that for you.
Representative Carmichael, any suggestions or comments at this point?
John Carmichael, State Representative. First, Mr. Chairman, I don't think I have any particular objections to the recommendations that you put out there. I think that's fine. Put that in our report. I think conceptually, I'm not sure that a one size fits all solution is the right solution. For example, if my barber has been out of the pen for a year, I don't think I'm going to worry too much about that. Okay. And by the way, my barber's a retired police officer and he ought to be in the pen, but that's a different matter. He's retired from barbery too, so he's just retired. But on the other hand, if my doctor taking care of my child has just gotten out of the sexually violent predator treatment unit out at Larned, I'm not so sure I really want him taking care of my kid. And so we have a scheme where a number of agencies have enacted statutes that fairly specifically define what disqualifying factors there are. There are others who have made those provisions through administrative rules and regulations, where they go through their KARs and say that, you know, conviction of felony theft is disqualifying. By implication, misdemeanor theft is therefore not disqualifying. There's also a body of case law that is out there. At one time, virtually every profession had a so-called morals clause in it, a disqualification based upon lack of moral character was typically the phrase. And I think the case was Vargas versus Board of Healing Arts, but I'm not certain about that, where our Supreme Court said you can't deny somebody a right to practice their profession based upon a vague standard. In other words, a subjective opinion on the part of the board as to whether this person does or does not have good moral character. And as a result, I think what we see is more and more agencies adopting qualifications for the practice of the profession based upon the perceived need of that profession, and then putting that either in statute or KAR. And I'll just also voice with you that I have some concern about limiting the power of municipalities to regulate occupations. It's not unusual for municipalities to have, well, I don't know if it'd be superseded, but a barber's license, and you know, you have various types of licenses that the city managed to pick up an extra $150 a year for issuing a license. But at the same time, there is a reason for local control, and the concept is those who are closest to the people govern the best. And I'm not sure that in the end that I will be a strong supporter of reforms, but for purposes of our report, I think it's certainly appropriate to consider these ideas. So I appreciate you hearing me out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for those comments. I think from listening to everyone at this point, I think our recommendations back to the committee are, number one, check all agencies that have employment restrictions. That's according to that subsection C of that 74-120. Those that have exceptions are not going to be looked at, but all the rest of them that aren't exempted need to be looked at. We need a listing of all those that are included and to find if they have made the appropriate changes at this point. Does that make sense, Jill and Jenna? And then we can look at those more closely and see if we need to do something at that point. In reference to Representative Carmichael's comments about the municipalities, I sympathize with these comments, but I think we need to take a little closer look at that to make sure that the spirit of the law is not being exceeded. So let's take a look at everything that's included in municipalities. I'm not saying we're going to do anything. I'm just saying we need a listing of all those that are exempted in that subsection. All the agencies or professions, whatever you want to call it. Does that make sense?
Mr. Chair, just for Jenna Moyer, Office Supervisor Statutes, just for clarity of the record and for the ease of Jill when writing this report, if we were going to have recommendations, it'd be nice to either take a vote or just come to consensus as a committee, just so that we can be sure what has been agreed upon and what has not been agreed upon.
Appreciate that, and we will. If we get, as soon as we get through with our recommendations, we'll take a vote and we'll move on from there. So the second one, I think reciprocity should be looked at and encouraged. The nurses did a compact, which I think has been very productive in handling some of the shortages there. And I think we should look at the reciprocities and see if we can encourage some. And to Representative Carmichael's point, teaching profession, if there are other states that have similar or as equally as difficult as Kansas, and maybe we could sign a compact with them and encourage those folks that are going after teaching degrees would receive one in one of those states. Something like that. I don't need that in the report. What I'm saying is, let's take a look at reciprocity and see if there's things in that that we can encourage as a committee that these agencies do. And from everything I've studied, yes, please.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I want the definition or the major difference. So if we use the scenario of veterans, military, allowing their spouses to come in to our state and immediately get a license to do whatever their profession is. So what's the difference then? So are we going to hold them to that same standard of the comment of what Representative John Carmichael just made of, even though they are a spouse of a military, that they too may not just be able to get that licensure because of those things that the representative just made, or do I need clarification, or am I talking about something totally different? Thank you.
No, I don't think you are. I think actually, if this is done correctly, an agency should apply their rules and regulations and to everyone equally. But those regulations and rules should not be so onerous that only their family members or friends can pass the test or make that possible. And I'm thinking here, one of the areas of real concern, probably shouldn't say this publicly, but the appraisers, that is a system that is nepotism at its best. Let's put it that way.
Well, Mr. Chairman, this is John Carmichael. I don't know whether it's nepotism or what goes on over there, but I do share your concern. I know that even when it came time for the governor to make appointments to the board, they had a hard time finding appraisers willing to be on the board from the appropriate congressional districts. And so, yeah, they've made it extremely hard to be an appraiser. And I share your concern. I do want to make, with the chair's permission, though, a brief correction. The case that I was referring to was not Vargas, it was Vakas, V-A-K-A-S, versus Board of Healing Arts. And for those who are interested, it can be found at 248 Can 589. It was a 1991 decision. So I said Vargas and I stand corrected. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We've all seen over the years some of these areas that we can point our fingers at, but I think we have to take more of a holistic approach and ask questions that hopefully will shine light on these areas. And maybe get legislators to become active and help out. So the two recommendations I have are to take a deeper dive into reciprocity and see if we can't come up with some kind of a fair system or encourage agencies to be more fair with their licensing. I don't know how you do that without going to court, as he suggested, but as that's expensive, a lot of people will just turn their back and not try to enter that profession. And that, again, that's the concern we brought up originally. and that's what formed the subcommittee, was we were worried about not only incarcerated, but the lower income and those starting out in life. We have put so many barriers up that how are they going to get a start? And that's a concern to all of us and should be. So we don't have a lot to recommend other than taking a deeper dive in both reciprocity and looking at the subsection C. Any other comments or suggestions for our report?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Representative Carmichael, do we need to make mention of reduction of barriers to reentry into the labor force, particularly from those who are exiting their rehabilitation in our state correctional institutions? Or is that something we should leave for another day?
No, I think we should mention it. In fact, one of the documents that was circulated was this Justice Reinvestment in Kansas report.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think that was excellent and should be referenced in our report as something that we are very concerned about, and the agencies should take a look at that report, if nothing else, and read it, which I'm sure they haven't.
And I think, Mr. Chairman, you and I are on the same page here. I just would hope that our recommendations would make specific mention of the elimination of barriers to reentry into the labor force. And whether you want to say specifically for incarcerated individuals, but there are other individuals as well who are now wanting to reenter the labor force, practice their professions, and probably encounter the same barriers. If, for example, I was to become disabled for 6 months or for 5 years, and then want to come back to practice my profession, they don't just let me back in. They do, require continuing education, and in some instances, even demonstration of proficiency. But I think we ought to mention that as a separate bullet point, barriers to reentry into professions or the labor market. And I would be happy to mention by formerly incarcerated individuals and others, or words to that effect.
Let it be so. Representative Senator Fasquedo, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you could comment again, you made a comment earlier, and I'm not sure if that was a recommendation or just you said barriers for people of color.
Yes, I did. Minorities
What was your point?
Well, from all the documents I've been reading, that is the occupational licensing has become, intentional or otherwise, has become a recognizable barrier to minorities and people of color to enter the workforce. And I think it's something, I think as a bullet point, we need to mention that. And they can even reference some of these documents here where they made those points, beyond what I even envisioned. The numbers and the percentages was remarkable. And I think that should be mentioned in the report.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, and I agree with that. About 5 years ago, the state NAACP did some research into all state agencies and licensures of professionals, and from a situation there in Topeka where a doctor, not a medical doctor, but Dr. Overstreet applied for certain issues or certain employment with state agencies, and they didn't hire her, but it continued to show up on the website that position was open. So then a formal research was done of all state agencies and licensures given to individuals in our state of and it showed very low numbers of all of our state agencies in the state of Kansas. It was a small percentage of African Americans, people of color, who were even hired or given those licensures. And so I'm going to look for that report that, in like I said, that was about 5 years ago. But I agree with that recommendation 100%. Thank you.
And the third point that I'd like to see in our little report is to highlight the right to earn a living law in Arizona and refer to that as a possible suggestion for future legislation. And based on that, I think I want the report written and then circulated between the three of us for correction or additions or subtractions, whatever, before it is finalized and given to the full committee on January the 8th. Is everybody comfortable with that?
Yes.
This is Representative Carmichael. I'm comfortable with that so long as we can comply with the Open Meetings Act. And I would defer to our reviser on how we can accomplish that without finalizing our recommendations outside of a public meeting.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. Jenna, Jill, your comments on that?
Mr. Chair, General Moyer, Office Supervisor Statutes, I would agree that the ideas for the report have to be finalized in order to comply with the Open Meetings Act. But if it is just typographical errors and you just respond directly to Jill, I don't believe that that should be a particular issue. But if there's anything of substance that needs to be corrected, it would make me very wary to do that over an email without an additional meeting.
And so this is Representative Carmichael again. In the unlikely event that a matter of substance should arise, how do I express my objection without violating the Open Meetings Act?
Would he have to request that we have another Zoom meeting to finalize the report? Is that how that would have to be done?
Mr. Chair, Jenna Moyer, that would be the safest course of action because if there were something that needed to be changed, the committee would have to agree on it if it were of substance in order to comply with.
Okay, so.
In other words, notify Ms. Shelley of whatever problems I have, and if any, and should they prove to be substantive in nature, I'm sure they'll notify the chair and we'll go from there. Is that? There's also another alternative, the Special Committee on Gaming. About a year and a half ago, the proposal was that the committee adjourn to a casino in New Orleans to complete the preparation of our report. And I'd be happy to, with this committee, to participate in that activity, Mr. Chairman, should you so choose.
Well, I think I can be arranged if your checkbook is used.
My recollection is there were scholarships being offered by the industry. I declined a scholarship. I never fancied myself as much of a scholar, as you know.
Anything else for the good of the committee? Staff, anything?
Yeah, could I just go down my list one time and make sure I've got the main points that you wanted to be included, please?
Sure, please.
So for recommendations, we're looking at having all the agencies that looking at 74-120C and looking at those exceptions, particularly those of municipalities. Then it's to look at reciprocity and encourage that as it's possible with the legislature, the state agencies. And then there's referencing barriers after a sentence is completed or for other reasons to look at the barriers. The state should be looking at the barriers to re-entry, not just after incarceration, but in other ways that after someone has been not in that particular workforce for a period of time. Oh, and also consideration of a bill on the right to earn a living. This stuff.
The only thing that I feel might have been missed there would be under that subsection C, all of those agencies that are not excluded. I wanted to we need to ask for a look to see if all of those that have complied with the law and are making changes, and a listing of those that have not done anything.
So specifically wanting a list of all the types of municipalities that might be included under that 120,
Two different topics, Jill. One is the subsection C, yes, looking at municipalities, I want a listing. We would like to see a listing of those that are included in there. That's one. Number two, then, all the others that were listed under subsection C that are not under municipalities, those agencies that have actually done something, and a listing of those that have done nothing. Okay? And then the reciprocity, I'm not sure how we're going to word that, but it's an area that the use of compacts and whatever is needed to open up or reduce some of the barriers to licensing for, in our new mobile society, this is going to become a very important issue. Any other comments from either Representative Carmichael or Senator Fausto for the addition of, I see it as those three main points for our report.
I have nothing further, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm fine with the recommendations that Jill just stated.
Great. Anything else for the good of the committee? Subcommittee. Staff, anything else? Thank you all for attending. I appreciate your time. It's very valuable and it was very helpful. Thank you very much. And we'll get back to the committee on the 8th after we've circulated and looked at the report that Jill is going to produce. And Jill, thank you very much. Jenna, thank you for your help. And Jordan, as always.
You're welcome.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to call them J, J, and J. Thank
Okay,
you.
good.
And Mr. Chairman,
Happy holidays to everybody.
I know you want to compliment Trevor as well, although I don't see his picture anymore, but he always makes, the zoom. So thanks.
That's true. That's true. Thank you for that reminder. Thank you. Jill?
Robin.
All right, folks. I declare this meeting closed.
Bye.
Bye-bye.